What we're going to do for the next half hour is, you might have noticed me eavesdropping on your running hot breakaway groups in the second session, scribbling notes, some of which I can no longer read, about some of the ideas that you came up with on the various subjects that you dealt with. Curiosity Matters with Juliet Gerard, the twin pools of research and commercialisation with Richard Blakey, and Telling the Truth with Brennan Wood. And I'm going to throw some of the things that I've picked up and have had handed to me by the facilitators of those various groups and get Nigel to comment on some of those things. The first thing I wanted to do is talk a bit about the first one that I went to, which was the commercialisation. And an example, listening, and we were looking for examples there of research which has led to some kind of commercial result. Next Window was one research group that came up, research initiative, which has ended up with touchscreen technology being pursued by HP and Dell. But in listening to that, another thing occurred to me, which is living in New Zealand. I asked myself, how many corporations have the discretionary income and the desire to spend money in research? And I started trying to rack my brains and think of some. I thought of a few. I thought of Fonterra in the dairy industry. I thought of the sheep and beef industry, and then I thought, oh no, they're in decline. But then I thought the wool price is going up, so that's good. I thought of Weta in terms of film technology. I thought of Fisher & somebody else thought of Fisher & Paykel, healthcare. But on the whole, there's not a lot in New Zealand. And I wanted to ask you, Nigel, how important it is when you're looking to grow your research budget, how important corporates are in putting money into that budget, into driving research, because they have the money to do so.
To which the answer is very. And it's no good trying to make out the opposite. I suspect that if you look at the British corporate research budget that's going into universities, it comes from a remarkably small number of companies. Big pharma, aerospace, automotive, and a few others of that ilk, which still have large research budgets which they're willing to move around. So there is a problem for New Zealand, I think, in terms of this, from what you've said. We, at the same time, also realise there is a very important group, though, of medium-sized, technologically sophisticated firms which you can work with. One which in particular we think about is a company, a German company, which is actually quite close to Warwick, called Brücke. And they do big magnets, which is a technology which is important, but obviously there aren't a lot of them around a lot of the time. And we have found that we've been able to work up a real conversation with them, which has led in turn to sponsor professorships and so on and so forth. So there are ways of going with that. The real problem then becomes small firms, and it's a reciprocal problem. You want small firms to do well, but they find it very difficult to do well, especially if they're in technological areas. One of the things we've done there, and we were talking about this previously, is that we have started to act as an honest broker for small firms. And what we do is we use our business school to put them together to bid for large contracts. In turn, they act as consortia, and they actually produce research resource of various kinds. That works very well, and there are a series of those kinds of things that in the future will be helpful. The British government at the moment is very keen on following a kind of technology centre policy. What that means is they're going to follow something roughly like Fraunhofer centres in Germany, which are very close to industry in theory, though there are quite big divergences of opinion about how successful they've actually been. And the first of these will be named in about 6 months' time at a guess. The competition has already started. The British government has also put together what it calls manufacturing technology centres, which are consortia of 15 or 16 companies, and the government actually builds a centre for them, and then they become foci of applied research. There are all kinds of things you can do, of that there's no doubt. But there is a real problem that without really large companies, you just don't have the budget when it comes to it, unless the government is willing to substitute, at least to begin with.
You mentioned during your speech earlier in the day the example of Jaguar Land Rover. Probably, because it hasn't happened just yet, has it? But it will. 170 positions at Warwick University. Which sounds great in terms of funding for the university and funding research. It does open up a question for me, which is the issue of academic independence, whether it's real or perceived. If you're getting a whole lot of money from a car manufacturer, and say a lot of people on your social sciences side are looking at the public transport and the benefits of, is that a problem?
Well, before we go any farther, there's bound to be some kind of problem of trying to work out where the boundary is on various things. And the real issue, I think, moves around intellectual property. But I have to say that I think the whole thing around intellectual property is overdone anyway. Many universities have produced vast numbers of patents. They produced all kinds of agreements with companies, etc. They have often quite large legal sections poring over contracts, and then actually they don't make much out of that intellectual property. And I think the feeling in the UK is moving towards freeing that up, actually, and being more willing to actually give IP away on the grounds that you should see IP not as a way of making money, but as, in a sense, a kind of community service. So I think that's where we'll go on that. Come back to Jaguar Land Rover. We're all right with them because we've been working with them since 1980. And they know us, we know them, and I don't think we feel that there are any massive tensions around this. But it's unusual, it has to be said, to have such a deep relationship with one company in that kind of way. And it does take a long time to do.
But is that a wider issue? If you mentioned the likelihood that government funding in the West for tertiary institutions and research is by no means guaranteed, even at the levels that it is now, let alone that we might improve them. We probably will have to deal with less. So therefore, the pressure or the need for funding would surely mean that we are likely to see or want to see or be tempted to want to have more corporates putting money into research, which is a good thing. But that issue of academic independence, being able to trust the researchers, that their research has not been influenced by the people paying for it, is that an issue that institutions will have to deal with even more in the future?
Well, I mean, there are cases, let me say straight away, where it causes difficulties in a sense. I mean, you'll often have to write in confidentiality clauses on publication of work. Often there'll be a 6-month delay or something like that written into the contract. Because the company wants to take away the results and do things with them. You have to, in certain cases, accept that. That's all there is to it. But you have to remember, if you're going to put research into the public domain, it's going to still go through the peer review process and so on. So there are all kinds of ways in which that research will be kept honest. Along with that, increasingly, medical research is a good example. The protocol is you have to declare if it's been done in connection with a corporate, and you have to declare what the interest was. If you didn't, it would be seen as a matter of severe suspicion nowadays, because there have been some scandals.
Curiously Matters was, I think I might have got that wrong the round way, but Juliet Gerard's group looked at the ethos and the justification for curious research driven by our pure need to know, our desire to find answers. And in listening to that before I bring up some of the things that came out of that discussion, I thought it would be worthwhile reminding you of what John Reynolds said in the Provocations, which in defence of the dead duck, which was that basic research gives us knowledge, applied research gives us solutions, but how can you get the former without having, or get the latter without having the former? You need to have basic research before you can do applied research.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, and this is true both in a university and in a sense nationally, if you've got no pipeline, then in a way you can apply away all you like, but you're going to be in trouble sooner or later. You have to have basic research there, actually, first off, even for applied research, because it's bringing forward potential solutions for the future, which you won't have thought of at the present. Having said that, there is research which is curiosity-driven, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. In all sorts of ways, no one can tell what kinds of things might turn up from scientific research. People head off in directions, and sometimes they find things they really weren't expecting at all. And indeed, you could argue that that's the real mark of good science, that you set up experiments which tell you something you didn't know and weren't expecting. Indeed, there are some philosophers of science who've said that that actually is the most important aspect of the whole scientific process. So, for me at least, yes, you have to have curiosity-driven research, and at the same time, you have to have applied research. But even industrialists, at least sensible ones, will tell you they want universities doing basic research. If they just all did applied research, it would be hopeless. Because where would the things those corporations are expecting to do in the future going to come from? So it seems to me absolutely crucial, even on that instrumental level. But, and again, I want to qualify this, there are certain things I think are done in science simply because they're deeply wonderful to do. And I think that's not anything wrong at all. I remember seeing recently Brian Cox, who's a TV physicist in the UK, and he did a program which was rather wonderful on various forms of life on the planet. And he came across, going deep into a cave, what you could argue is a form of life. It probably isn't, called snotite.
Is that in caves, is it?
That's exactly what it looks like. But I can't remember it exactly, but it sort of does something like, it actually works on sulfuric acid or something like that. And it's quite extraordinary to think that these kinds of things exist on this planet. And that, in a sense, is where science and religion, in a way, meet, in that kind of degree of wonder. And I think that's great. Some of the findings going on in quantum physics at the moment are so unbelievable that they move over into realms we can't understand, really, at all. I mean, it's quite extraordinary when you can have things interacting a very long way apart instantaneously, as though space, in a way, didn't matter. So things like that are, wow! Just wow. And I always think, when the arts and humanities people start to go, you don't understand about these kind of things, just think about some of the things that people are doing in science at the moment.
Well, I must say that a duck that wants to make love to a dead duck is a fascinating prospect. Why do they want to do that? Yeah, and I did wonder whether, is there an applied thing in that? What if it has bird flu?
I thought that the abstract...
Maybe that's the telltale sign.
The abstract was profoundly suspect because it was completely anthropomorphic. It was, the ducks indulging in necrophilia. What does that mean in terms of duck think? I haven't got a clue.
At Warwick University, has the balance between basic and applied research changed over the last, or during your tenure? And if it has, in what way has it gone?
Gosh, I don't think, funnily enough, it's changed that much. The university makes money in order to do, a lot of the time, basic research. the same thing happens, as you might imagine, with, say, something like Oxford University Press and Oxford University. And the money's ploughed back into, for example, new lectureships, etc., etc., etc. What we have done, on the whole, is to have some applied research outfits, of which Warwick Manufacturing Group is the most important. They do cause us some problems, and they're not without problems. One of them is that the scientists who are in these outfits are not there to kind of get vast citations, etc., etc. They're there to help work on processes of various kinds, etc. Very applied. But we can live with that tension because we think it's important to do that kind of work and the basic work.
Do you have to spend more energy now than in the past arguing the case for basic research?
It's a good question. There are a lot of people who say, a bit like government ministers often say they like the arts and humanities, and you say, how do you know that? And they said, well, I went to the opera last week. It's the same kind of thing with basic research. They will always say, well, of course, universities are about fundamental knowledge and about, producing civility in society and these kind of things. But on the other hand, we do want you to make sure you're contributing to the economy. And that's quite a difficult argument to kind of get around in a way, because they'll all agree that they believe that universities are for a particular kind of thing, which is a lot of the time disinterested knowledge generation of. But at the same time, when it comes to it, their instinct is always to move towards trying to generate economic value. And it's no good trying to make out, I think, that it's anything other than that. And I can't think of many systems in the world where that isn't the case. There may be some, maybe New Zealand is brilliant at it, but I can't think of many.
Now, one of the other things that came out of the Curiosity Group was the idea that in this country, and it sounds to me like yours too, there is so much uncertainty about the funding process, how it goes. It's always changing. Maybe we just get rid of that and just focus on marketing, bypass the funders. Does that sound like a good idea to you?
No. Look, certainly in the UK, the government's putting a very large amount of money, absolutely, into research funding. And without it, very large amounts of research would not take place, full stop. And the corporate sector, for example, will never substitute for all of that. It just won't. And indeed, the corporate sector often argues that we are paying taxes precisely for universities to be doing that work. So I don't think that would work. But I know that underlying what you're asking, there is an issue about simply how difficult it is becoming to get research funding. And I hadn't understood when people were laughing this morning that success rates have become so low in New Zealand. I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. That for me would be a serious crisis. I think most people think if you go below 10%, the disincentive, especially for younger researchers, is extraordinary, because you have, as a younger researcher, you need to get some kind of grant, in your first 3 to 5 years, simply to keep morale up, let alone anything else, and to get your foot on the table. So it's extraordinarily important to do that. And without it, it's desperately difficult. And most people think that if you go below 30%, you're actually starting to get into trouble. So, there we are.
Should researchers be putting energy at all into trying to get money for their projects, or should they be divorced from that, left to totally focus on what they're doing, and somebody else does the spruiking for cash?
Well, this is where the UK actually is quite good. I try to think back to my research youth, which is increasingly difficult for me to do. One of the things that we didn't have then was vast numbers of fellowships. And one of the things there are now in the UK, very large numbers of fellowships, especially for early career, but also for later career researchers, from the Wellcome Trust, from the research councils, and so on and so forth. And you need a supply of those fellowships, because I don't think, on the whole, and will be controversial, that it's the business of younger researchers to have to go out and get, the equipment and so on and so forth. It's inevitable that, later on, as you get older, that becomes part of your task if you're running a research group, and you're there then, as a scientist, to get the money. And that's all there is to it. If you're not doing that, then obviously you're not sustaining a research group. But early on, in that point when really the competition is extraordinarily tough in international science, you need to be there sitting and concentrating on what you're doing. I'm sorry, but I genuinely do believe that. I feel there'll be some hostility about this, but I think it's desperately important that you do. And I have to say as well that that's often the time when people have some of their greatest ideas. In fact, mathematicians, on the whole, they've had their greatest ideas by then.
Telling the truth, looked that particular
Sorry,
hotspot.
don't film that bit. Some of my best friends are mathematicians. Some of my best friends were mathematicians.
Spoken like a true geographer. Telling the truth, science communication. They talked about the Jackie Onassis model.
Which is?
Marry first for love, then for money, then for companionship. Now, I assume the companionship bit was companionship with the public. And you mentioned civil society as being a big part of the mix in terms of where the university places itself. And I was thinking about civil society and pop culture and popular discourse. And, one issue that keeps on coming back, which interests me as a broadcaster, is the debate on climate change and the populist points of view put forward by both sides, and whether the public is an ally or an enemy when it comes to science.
Okay. The first thing to say is that nowadays, I think most universities take, certainly in terms of science, and I might add in terms of arts and humanities and social sciences, they take this as one of the primary things that their communications department's doing. Most British universities would have a specialist science communications officer of some kind or another. Many universities have professors of public understanding of science. We actually have a fellow of public understanding of philosophy, which has worked fantastically well. You can't believe how well it worked. A woman called Angie Hobbs, who's very televisual, it has to be said, and it's staggeringly good what works in terms of this. I just can't believe how successful this has actually been. When someone first came and said, "Why don't I become a public fellow in the understanding of philosophy?" I went, "You what?" But actually, there are all kinds of moral dilemmas that you can actually intervene in. And someone who can talk clearly and to the point about those kind of things, it works extraordinarily well. I'd recommend it to anybody. But these things happen in other ways as well. Is the public an ally or an enemy? It comes back to civil society in some ways. A lot of the time, the public doesn't know much, but it feels a lot. And you need to be very aware that a lot of the time you're not intervening necessarily about actually facts themselves, but actually what you're trying to intervene in is what people feel about particular kinds of research. That's easy when it's medical research. On the whole, they're not going to turn their noses up at that, but it is more difficult with other kinds of research. But I think you have to keep really a serious amount of humility around these kind of things and realize that that public often knows things better and does things better than you do. There's a classic Steve Coogan joke that I probably shouldn't tell you, but I will. It goes something like, David Beckham may not be very bright, but then Stephen Hawking isn't very good at football. And I think you have to be you have to be very aware that there are plenty of people in the public who may not understand these issues, but they know other things far better than you actually do. And you have to be very careful to remember that, and to remember that they often can be brought round to your point of view just as long as you don't appear snotty. And if there has been a fault that universities have had in the past, it's, I think, that they have appeared somewhat snotty.
I think I was getting a T signal there. Have we got time for one more question? One more question. Well, I'm being a bit selfish here. In terms of communication with the public, one thing that's a bugbear of broadcasters, and I think a lot of people in the public when it comes to scientists, is jargon. Use of, you can all want to kill me now for mentioning that word, jargon, but for example, in your own profession, what is non-representational theory, Nigel? I've been asking out there and nobody can really tell me.
Yeah, anyway, I think we're finishing now. There's a lot of, let's not talk about non-representational theory, because just take it from me, it's brilliant.
Wait for my blog, mate.
Yeah. But whether you like it or not, scientific discourse is working in concepts which are going to appear to the outside often as jargon, but they are not. They are ways of being precise about things and about processes and about models. The problem is when people then try and use that kind of jargon when they're talking in a more general domain. That's the problem. And certainly academics ought to be, as a matter of course, and most universities I think do this now, getting media training about putting across simply what it is that they do. But we haven't got time to talk simply about non-representational theory.
Nigel, thanks very much.